Cross Blue Shield of Mississippi. It's good to be blue. The official healthcare provider of the Out of Bounds show, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Mississippi. We're live in the Bank Plus studio. Out of Bounds, ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Our guests join us on the Miller Lite guest line. We welcome in Mike Detillier, WWL Radio, TV, New Orleans NFL insider, and the late, great Don Shula passes away at 90 years old yesterday. And legendary coach, 347 wins, championships, and Hall of Famer and coached Hall of Famers. So Mike followed a good bit of his career. And Mike, without question, Coach Shula, one of the best ever.
No question about it. I know, for me, and I actually told him this. He had Shula's Steakhouse here for a couple years in New Orleans, and got an opportunity to talk to him and do interviews with him twice. Actually, they were pulling it out of the vault where we interviewed him. Man, this was back in '99. He had started it and then went on for a few years, but he had shut it down. Just a really respectful guy. Growing up in the '70s, he was the gold standard where Lombardi certainly kind of carved that niche out in the 60s. It was Shula in the 70s and those great Dolphin teams. And I remember when we had a weekly feature for 2 years with Hank Stram at one of the casinos.
Oh, wow.
in Mississippi. And and I got to know Hank pretty well. He didn't live that far from where I'm at. And he had brought up about how difficult it was to go up against Shula's teams. And he said, tremendous respect for Don, that his teams played hard. They played with great discipline. He wouldn't put up with a lot of outside distraction. And Hank brought up that, listen, it was different. He was coaching in Kansas City. He said, Miami and South Beach, that's a different story, where many more distractions there than in Kansas City. And he just had tremendous respect. And he tells me the story that Shula was one of the first guys that really put great emphasis on special teams. And he said, when I was in Kansas City and Don was in Baltimore, where he started, he said we would watch film in the off season, and he said it wasn't about special teams play as a unit. It became special teams play individually. And he said we adopted that philosophy. What he did in Baltimore, we did in Kansas City. So he said I learned that from having watched what Shula was doing in Baltimore. And one of the things Don would always bring up was about losing Super Bowl III, and the pressures of that, because at that time, the AFL was looked down at. It was the big brother in the NFL, and the AFL, kind of sort of the minor leagues. And he had one of the best teams ever. They had only lost one game all year long. They head into that game 18.5-point favorites, and Namath and the Jets just drilled them. And he had to carry that. And he said he's convinced that led to the separation of him and Baltimore because of the owner. And Carol Rosenblum was sort of, I guess best word to put it, he was upset that he became the first of the guys to lose the Super Bowl to an AFL team. So he said, I carried that. And he brought it into Miami, and Hank told me when he took the job in Miami, he called Shula and said, are you doing the right thing? And Tom was like, Hank, man, with the amount of money they're paying me, my contract was up. I'm not going to turn this down. And he said, I've got full autonomy here to kind of run the franchise. And Hank said, looking back at it, it was a really smart move because of the fact that already he had in place Bob Greasy and Larry Zonka. He said, back then, that was two big pieces of the puzzle, that you had your quarterback, you had your running back, And he said, Don was able to build on that, and you wonder a little bit how much longer that run would have lasted with Shula and the Dolphins. But the World Football League got involved, and they signed Zonka, Jim Kick, Paul Warfield to the Memphis team in the World Football League. And it ended the run of the Dolphins and opened the door, so to speak, for the Steelers to make that great run. And so, you look at that toward the end, so as you get in the mid-'70s, Zonka, Kick, and Warfield are not there anymore. They're gone because they had signed this major deal with the new World Football League. And, it went under, but still, it sort of ended Shula's really hard run when, he had pieced together some just unbelievable teams. But, one of the greatest coaches of all time. And just his ability to last that long is, to me, and I told him this, I thought was a great testimony, because a lot of times coaches don't adapt to something new in the world. And he was a heavy run-oriented coach in the 70s. Heavy run. Same thing when he was in Baltimore in the 60s. They were a run-oriented team, despite the fact that they had Unitas. And then he gets Dan Marino in '83, and they become a pitch and catch team.
Mm-hmm.
They become one of the first ones, man, to really pitch and catch it all over the field. Already Walsh had the West Coast offense, but Marino stretched that field.
Was it Clayton and Moore? Who were the two wide receivers down there?
Clayton and Mark Duper.
Duper. I loved Duper. I was a kid. I was 11 in '84. And those were when you were, Mike, this living in this area, we were starting to get just a little bit more NFL during that time. And the two teams to me that were just incredible, like very, very entertaining to watch as a kid, were Shula and Marino and Air Coryell and Dan Fouts at that time. That was just fun football, Mike, because most everybody was kind of like Gibbs and Theismann, 3 yards in a cloud of dust, if you know where I'm going.
Yeah, and you had it that Coryell actually did that in St. Louis before he went to San Diego. Yeah, he was the coach in St. Louis, and he had Jim Hart that was there, and they had Metcalf and Jim Otis, who was a former Saints player. But, man, they threw the football all over the field, and they were a very entertaining team. But like what happened – now, his San Diego teams got a little bit farther than the Cardinals teams, but Don really kind of revolutionized the game and a lot of his thinking. When he was in college, he certainly did that. And the Bidwell family sort of leaned a lot of times on college coaching. And you look at he fired Coryell, and what does he do? He brings Bud Wilkinson out of retirement. Bud had coached in over 20 years. And he hires the former Oklahoma coach to be his head coach. So, but Don was way ahead of the curve with that, and he was able to change and adapt to the talent he had. Now, Nat Moore was on that team, but man, Duper and Clayton and were marvelous. Here's a crazy story about Mark Duper. Mark played at Northwestern State in Louisiana with Coach O and Bobby Hebert.
What?
Yes, he was on those same teams. First time I ever met Duper was visiting the guys at Northwestern, and it was Coach O that told me, "Man, we got a guy here. You ought to see Mike. He's unbelievable. His speed." And he said, "But he don't know nothing about football." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "No, he didn't play high school football. They didn't have enough guys, and at his high school." To field a high school team. So he ran track. And one of the Northwestern coaches saw him run track and said, "Man, you want to play football?" And he was like, "I guess." And so they got him, they signed him, and he started to learn how to play football. And how he caught Don Shula's eye, Coach Shula tells me the story that at the Combine, and he said it was regional back then. You used to have to, it was one in Indy. I think there was one in New Orleans at one time, one in Florida, one in California. He said Duper comes to the one in Florida. They throw him a pass, and he said without hesitation, it's over his head, and he just sort of Willie Mays catches it over the top and makes the catch. And Shula was like, "Man, I want him. I want that guy if he can make those type of catches." And he said, off of that one catch, we did a lot of work on Mark Duper and found out. And so I was telling him the story about Coach O telling me, and he's like, "Mike, he's absolutely right about that deal." But I remember going to Natchitoches and Coach O and Bobby talking about, "Man, we got a guy, Mike. You talking about he can play, but he's never played high school football." And it was Mark Duper.
Wow.
And Shula picked up on the fact that he had some instincts as a receiver that even though he didn't play high school football, he was still really good at. And to kind of, catch the ball over the top of your head, like what he was doing was remarkable. So, at that time, man, I think about the Northwestern team, that was Bobby, that was Coach O, that was Duper, and that was a little running back by the name of Joe Delaney.
Yes.
Who became the AFC Rookie of the Year. And Joe was a great guy. They was always teasing him about one thing and another. Man, he was country. You talking about country. Now, we grew up on the bayou, but he was country as country could be. And Bebe's dad, Coach O's dad, Mr. Bebe, goes over there, and he is barbecuing a pig before the game outside. And the police are fixing to tell him to get lost with that machinery. But once they found out they could eat, then everything was okay. So Mr. Babeham, he was making hog head cheese, and they didn't have cups to put the hog head cheese in. But his mom, Coco, she worked at a not a grocery store. They sold furniture, and a furniture store. And she looked in the back, and they would give kids snow cones. They had a snow cone machine.
Yeah.
And so her deal was, let's see if we can put that hog head cheese in a snow cone. And so they gave it to Joe Delaney. Well, let's just say this. Joe loved eating it, but it did not quite agree with him. So here you had this. He was one of the fastest guys to play. And, he ate it, and it went through him pretty quickly. So he was en route, so to speak, after he ate it. God bless him. You talk about a hero. He was that. He didn't know how to swim, and he dies trying to save some kids swimming in a pond they shouldn't have been swimming in. And one of the kids survived. I think the two others passed away, and so did Joe. Trying to save, some kids swimming in a deep pond that they shouldn't have been in. But here's the crazy part: Joe didn't know how to swim at all. And Bill Johnson tells the story because Bill was one of the first ones to know about it. Now Bill's the defensive line coach at LSU, but Bill was at Northwestern too. Bill was the defensive line coach at Northwestern. So you talk about they had some talent there,
man,
with Joe Delaney. With Mark Duper, and there was a young freshman where they was fixing to graduate. His name was John Stevens, and he became the Rookie of the Year with the New England Patriots as a running back. And he played 1 year of high school football. He was a baseball player before that. So, LSU wasn't cranking out guys like that.
No.
Little school in Natchitoches was, but, man, Duper was special. And I do remember Coach Shula, as we were talking, he would bring up, man, I don't know who LSU's recruiting coordinator was back then, but he wasn't doing a real good job to let, Bobby and, Coach O went there for a little while, but Duper and Delaney and all these other guys and Stevens all sort of slip away, and so, but that's the way it was. But Don was a great coach, very respectful guy, had his own business in the restaurant world, was a pretty sharp guy. And I do remember the first interview with him asking, how do you think we'll do here in New Orleans with this steakhouse? And I told him, well, Coach, you're going to have a lot of competition. And he just started to laugh. He said, I get you. But great storyteller. He knew so many things from, you think about, he coached Johnny Unitas. You think about that. he was with Unitas and those Colts teams, and Bubba Smith, when Bubba was alive, Bubba used to come fishing out here. Bubba loved to fish. Bubba was a Texas guy. And, man, you talk about you needed a boat to get Big Bubba in. Even though he had lost some weight from his playing days, Bubba would get in that boat and go red fishing. Man, he loved that. And so I would tell him, I seen Bubba, and he was like, man, that's all Bubba talked about was going fishing. That's all he wanted to do was go fishing. And so, Don was something else. And you think about perfection in football, he got it.
Wow. Let's discuss
he chased
that.
Perfection and got it.
What Mike Detillier, NFL insider on the Miller Lite guest line, WWL Radio TV New Orleans, talking Coach Shula, who coached Unitas, Greasy, and Marino, which is amazing. All right, what really jumps out at you about that season, Mike? Either an obstacle they had to overcome, something
Greasy
funny,
breaking his ankle.
Okay.
I mean, early on that year, I can recall this was against the Chargers, and Greasy goes down. Back then, they had almost like a little ambulance thing, and Greasy, they didn't have a cart or nothing. They just sort of rolled the cart out there, and a couple guys rode Bob off. And all of a sudden, Earl Morrall, Earl had bounced all over the NFL, but Earl was on that Super Bowl III team that had lost to the Jets. And then Earl, you talk about Super Bowl V, he was on that team that got to the Super Bowl with Unitas, and Unitas gets hurt in the Super Bowl, and Morrow takes over, and the Colts end up winning it. The Colts cut him loose. Shula picks him up. He's on that team, and he wins every game, gets him to the Super Bowl, and Greasy's healthy. And Don had to make the call. And he told me it was a difficult choice. He said at that time, I just want to make sure that Greasy was healthy and could play. But he said, I was going to play the best guy. And he said, Earl knew it. And so I pulled Earl, who had got us there. And basically, they ended up winning it. But I remember that, how many times a team would lose a starting quarterback that early in the year, and then you chase perfection that year.
That's incredible.
You get it.
Think about how he felt being replaced.
Yeah, but Earl was used to it. Earl became an assistant coach, and man, I'm dating myself here. Howard Schnellenberger was at Miami of Florida. Earl Morrall was recruiting in Louisiana for the Hurricanes. He was the first one to come down to New Orleans to start recruiting in this area. Now, he left. He didn't like the coaching world. He didn't like the hours involved. And all of a sudden, Schnellenberger takes off because he thought he had a deal in the World Football League. It didn't work out. And they bring in Jimmy Johnson. And Jimmy brings in this crazy Cajun from the Bayou to coach his defensive line, Ed Ogeron. And Ed ends up going to Miami or Florida to coach and being a defensive line coach for Coach Johnson. And then Ed started recruiting the Louisiana area. And then once Ed left, Curtis Johnson, who's now the wide receiver coach for the Saints.
Yeah,
he was there, and he recruited here. So, and he was able to get guys like Reggie Wayne, Ed Reed.
Ooh, hello. Golly.
And so, it's but Earl getting in there when Greasy broke the ankle, to me, that was an unbelievable run to that. But it was so run-oriented and had Mercury Morris and Kick and Zonka. And then when they threw it, you had a guy like Paul Warfield who could go out and make the catch. And the two tight ends, Jim Mandich from Michigan and Marv Fleming, who had played in Super Bowl I and II with the Packers. Shula got him and put him, he got him for the Dolphins. But that no-name defense would be the number two thing for me. Most people at that time, they couldn't name you three guys off that defense. And Nick Bonaconte was probably the biggest name of the group of guys. And he became a fantastic player. He's an NFL Hall of Famer. But you remember the two safeties, Jake Scott, Dick Anderson. man, you threw in their area, you're going to get it picked off. And that no-name defense was just terrific. Bill Arnsparger coaching that defense.
LSU eventually.
Yeah, and he was. I think they had 4 eventual NFL head coaches. I know Monty Clark was one who coached the offensive line. He went to San Francisco. But man, Shula had a great staff. They won big. But the two things that jump out about that undefeated team was Greasy going down, Morrow comes in and leads them all the way up until the Super Bowl, and Greasy takes over. But that no-name defense was just so good, and they just stuffed you. So, hey, listen, if you got 17 points, you were going to win. They weren't going to give you much else. They were just terrific, well-coached, disciplined, understood the game. But I think the most famous game with Shula had nothing to do with that. Is when they snapped, the Bears were riding high that fabulous year, and they go down to Miami, and they get skunked. Marino passes them silly that game, and it was the only loss the Bears had all season long. But that Monday night game, and, man, I've heard it from enough guys that in the locker room at halftime, Mike Ditka and Buddy Ryan almost come to blows, because Buddy refused to adapt to what Shula was throwing stuff at him that they hadn't seen before, and they could not adapt to it, and they ended up putting the 1L on the Bears. And so that would have been the one team you look back at it throughout the years and say that team could have went and had perfection, but it was Miami that spoiled it.
We'll leave it there. Mike Detillier, at Mike Detillier on Twitter. Also find him on Facebook and NFL Insider, WWL Radio TV New Orleans. That was a fun 20 minutes on Don Shula, who passed away yesterday. Legendary coach, and also all the stories you're hearing about a super guy, too. And, of course, the undefeated season in 72 with several championships, and he got to coach Unitas, Greasy, and Marino, which is pretty darn amazing at that position. Mike Detillier on the Miller Lite guest line. Mike, have a great week. Thanks, bud.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
That was fun. Walk down memory lane. I didn't know about the 70s stuff because I don't remember that. But only Mike would know, like, all these people, and then they're tied to Louisiana. I didn't know Mark. I mean, I loved Mark Duper as a kid. Duper and Clayton. Dude, Marino, all he did was just complete every single pass to them. It was almost like pitch and catch. It was almost like throwing against air. Marino was so good. Marino and Fouts. I mean, Montana, too, no doubt. But maybe because they didn't win it. You look at what they did, and you're like, wow, that was fun. I had no idea. Northwestern State. Blake, Mark Duper, one of my favorite wide receivers of all time. My first favorite was Ahmad Rashad with the Vikings. But then I got into, of course, Jerry Rice and Duper and that whole crew later. Hour number 3 coming up.